China Mac's story is one of the wildest in the rap game. From growing up in the chaos of New York's Chinatown, repping one of the city's most notorious gangs, and serving time for attempted murder, to becoming a social activist and beefing with Vlad TV and No Jumper, he's been through it all. Born in the 1980s to Chinese immigrant parents, China Mac grew up surrounded by violence. His father, nicknamed Fox, was a high-ranking member of the Flying Dragons, a powerful Chinese gang known for running heroin and eliminating rivals without hesitation. As a kid, China Mac admired the respect his father commanded and wanted to follow in his footsteps. Chinatown at the time was a war zone, with rival gangs like the Ghost Shadows and Flying Dragons fighting for control. Violence spilled into the streets, and headlines frequently reported the chaos. One of the most infamous moments came in 1992, when the Flying Dragons ambushed and executed a Ghost Shadows leader, Vin Tang Luong, in broad daylight on Queens Boulevard. This hit escalated the gang war, prompting police to crack down on the Chinese underworld. Johnny Eng, aka Machine Gun Johnny, was the Flying Dragons' ruthless leader. He maintained a grip on the crew and reportedly trained affiliates on a Pennsylvania property. Fox, China Mac's father, was a top lieutenant in the gang, allegedly taking direct orders from ENG. But everything changed when Fox was arrested and flipped, becoming an informant for the feds. Fox's betrayal led to the downfall of Machine Gun Johnny and the Flying Dragons. But for China Mac and his family, it was devastating. Once respected in Chinatown, they were now seen as outcasts. Life became dangerous for China Mac and his mom, and the young Mac turned to rap and the streets to cope. At 12, China Mac ran away from home and joined the Ghost Shadows, the very gang his father's crew had been at war with. By then, he was no stranger to crime, having first been sent to juvie at just 8 years old for throwing a brick at someone. With the Ghost Shadows, he got deeper into street life, racking up charges for robbery and assault. China Mac's journey from these violent beginnings to where he is now is nothing short of incredible, proving that even in the darkest circumstances, transformation is possible.
I grew up in juvenile, you know what I'm saying? That's where my first year, my first age going into juvie, like I was 8 years old.
What did you do at 8, bro?
Like some wild shit.
The Chinatown crews operated on a different level than gangs like the Bloods and Crips. When China Mac joined the Ghost Shadows, there was no jumping-in ritual. Instead, he had to prove his loyalty by swearing an oath in front of a Buddha statue and drinking chicken blood. For China Mac, this wasn't just about joining a gang, it was personal. His father's betrayal as a snitch had stained the family name, and China Mac felt like he had to prove to everyone that he wasn't like his dad. He lived with a chip on his shoulder, always ready for smoke, which led to him spending most of his life behind bars. At 18, he caught his first serious charge and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. But instead of slowing him down, prison hardened him. When he got out, he went right back to the streets, and less than a year later, he caught a charge that almost ended his freedom for good. On November 9, 2003, things spiraled out of control. That day, China Mac's girlfriend was arrested, and he was feeling the pressure. He went out with some friends to clear his head, but the night took a dangerous turn. Years earlier, China Mac had been stabbed by someone who nearly killed him. The blade missed his heart by less than an inch. Though he survived, the trauma stuck with him. His homies later identified the attacker, and China Mac held onto the grudge, vowing to kill him if their paths ever crossed again. That night, as he and his crew were hanging out, one of his friends started talking to someone. At first, China Mac didn't think much of it, but then it hit him. This was the guy who had stabbed him. The realization sent a surge of anger through him. Right there, in the middle of a busy street, China Mac pulled out his gun, ready to end it. But before he could pull the trigger, one of his friends jumped in front of him and stopped him from shooting. The moment was tense, but his friend's intervention may have saved China Mac from a murder charge and the life sentence that would have come with it. This was just one of many close calls in China Mac's life, reflecting the intense struggles and decisions that defined his early years.
My boy gives me this look like, oh, and then from right there, as soon as he made that face, I knew who he was. So I pulled out the gun, right? I pulled out the gun, and then I raised the gun, and my boy jumped in front of the gun and grabbed it like, no, not right here.
After the guy who stabbed China Mac ran off, he went to a club with his crew, still angry. At the club, he saw Gene, a Chinese-American rapper who was getting popular at the time. One of China Mac's friends claimed Gene had disrespected someone they knew in prison, so China Mac decided to confront him. He and his crew cornered Jean in a hallway, and when Jin's friend Christopher Louis tried to step in, someone shouted that Christopher had a knife. China Mac pulled out his gun, aimed at Christopher's head, and pulled the trigger, but the gun jammed. Jean and Christopher ran, but after fixing the gun, China Mac shot Christopher in the back. Knowing the police would be after him, China Mac went on the run for a year. He tried escaping to Canada, but his passport was flagged, and he was arrested and sent back to New York. At Rikers Island, he thought he'd get a life sentence because of his past crimes. However, his lawyer found a mistake in his record. One of his previous felonies was actually a misdemeanor. This saved him from life in prison, and he was sentenced to 11 years instead. A year into his sentence, his mother visited him in prison, crying the whole time. Afterward, China Mac broke down in his cell. An older inmate gave him advice. He needed to decide what kind of life he wanted to live. That moment made China Mac realize he needed to change.